Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Uli, and this is episode 105 of the Forge of Freedom. I'm happy to be joined today by Mike ter Maat. Mike is a Libertarian candidate for President of the United States. Mike campaigned in 2021-2022 as the Libertarian Party candidate in the January special congressional election in Florida's District 20. And before that, he served as a police officer in Broward County from 2010 through 2021 as a registered libertarian. Mike's prior career in finance and economics included work with banks as a commercial loan officer, the White House Office of Management and Budget as a financial economist, and as a consulting economist to 3 other federal and international agencies in the field of economic development. From 1992 through 2002, Mike was an advocate in Washington for free markets in the financial services industry. In 2002, he started a professional education business for bank executives, which he successfully ran until 2009, including conferences, webcasting, and strategic consulting. Mike has traveled through 35 countries, taught economics at 3 universities, and substituted at dozens of Broward public schools. He has 1 wife, 2 kids, and 2 stepdaughters, 2 dogs, and 1 truck, a BS in aeronautical engineering, and an MBA from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and a master's and PhD in economics from the George Washington University. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Mike.
Well, Alex, it's a great joy to be with you. Thank you. That's probably more bio than your audience is interested in. And I couldn't help noticing you included the word, which must apparently be in the website bio, webcasting. Those are the days, huh? That's actually before your time, I think. You must have been in high school when we were doing webcasts.
Yeah.
We were on the cutting edge, and a fun format it was to learn how to use.
Yeah. Webcasting, it's something a term I hadn't heard in a while, but I think people get the idea about what it means.
Yeah, it's not so different from a podcast. It was essentially a podcast with original OG technology.
Right. Well, Mike, thanks a bunch for tagging along today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I want to focus, as you know, we were discussing pre-show here. I want to focus on your ideas and your campaign position with respect to police reform, with respect to criminal justice reform, and of course, drawing on your experience as a law enforcement officer. But before we get to that, and before we dive into that topic, would you mind to say a little bit about yourself, how you got into politics, and a little bit about your campaign for presidency?
Sure, a little bit. I think everybody knows that I'm running for the Libertarian Party nomination for president. There are several other fellas that are in the race as well. They are all terrific, and so I don't mean to say anything disparaging, because I love each and every one of them for completely different reasons. But I will probably secure the nomination in May and go on to the general election. And we're building a team to execute on that in the way that I think is important. Indeed, the reason I am in this race, Alex, is because I believe that I can push the Libertarian Party's process in a direction to be more successful than we have in the past. By that, I mean, I think there's, generally speaking, 2 categories of things that we need to do better than we have in the past. And one is in the general election, to run a campaign that is completely differentiated from Republicans and Democrats. We have to run, in my estimation, a very principles forward, a very unapologetically libertarian message. I'm running on what we call a Gold New Deal, which your audience can read about at goldnewdeal.org. I won't go into the details right now, but the idea is to forge, if I can borrow your word, a new relationship between us and the government, especially the federal government, but between us and the state government and local government as well. And a lot of that means decentralizing the power and authority of the government. A lot of that means winnowing down the size and scope of government. And it means empowering local communities to take back some of that power from the federal government. And at the same time, the second thing that I think that we need to do, that we haven't always done a great job of in the Libertarian Party, is to run a very, very credible, competitively credible campaign, a very professional campaign. We've got 18 people on our team that are already on our payroll in a modest, small way. We are almost ready for the general election now. Not quite ready, but we're ahead of schedule. We will be ready by the end of May when the nomination process takes place. And we work very hard at preserving our credibility. So, for example, we are running on quite transformational ideas, as you and I are about to discuss. I think that makes doubly important, the need to preserve your credibility, to back things up with detail, with how are you going to do that, with realistic expectations. All of that becomes important. It's also the reason that our campaign leans very hard into my own personal background in public service and public policy, both in terms of having been a professional economist for a couple of decades, as well as having worked as a police officer for 11 and a half years on the road in quite a diverse set of communities in Florida. We take all of that very seriously. And I think that it helps us clear what I believe is a threshold of credibility that Americans, especially donors and media, expect you to clear before they take you seriously. So that's sort of how we see the campaign at the moment.
So I have to say here at the outset, I really appreciate your approach to this campaign. I discovered your campaign and you as a candidate through one of the debates. I can't remember which of the debates that I saw first, but I've been watching them periodically on YouTube, and I appreciated your approach, and as you say, sort of principles forward approach, but also very professional. And I'm glad you used the word forge, because I think your campaign sort of embraces this idea. You're not just sort of passively reflecting on principles and spouting them off on social media. You're actually out there talking about solutions, and not just principle, but solutions. And I think that's an important thing. So I appreciate that. Thank
And
you
how
for
it affects our everyday problems, right? How it affects all kinds of Americans in different ways. And part of the big reason why I was so excited about the idea of joining you today is because I know that you want to talk about communities and you want to talk about police reform and law enforcement and the criminal justice system in general. And I think it's so important. So often we don't talk about these issues in presidential campaigns, right? Because we figure, the amount that a president can do is limited. The amount that the federal government can do is limited. And so, should we be talking about these? And I think that the resolute answer is yes, because a presidential candidate and a president, of course, can certainly lead that conversation in a way that people will hear. And I think that all too often there are communities with decent ideas and they're hesitant to put that first step forward, unless there's a national conversation sort of embracing the idea of thinking outside the box. It's real hard to do at the local level.
Yeah. Well, and as most of my listeners know, I'm an attorney. I handle a lot of criminal defense cases. I handle a lot of drug cases. So this is an issue that is near and dear to me. I see the effects of prohibition and the war on drugs and sort of systemic issues within policing and the criminal justice system more broadly. I see it every day. And it's more problematic than I think people imagine than it is. A lot of folks day to day don't understand how the sausage is made, so to speak. And I think are horrified when they learn just a little bit about it. So with that said, let's get into criminal justice reform and police reform. As you say, a lot of times as libertarians, people might say, well, what, as you said, what does the president have to do with this? So let's start there. What does the president have to do with this, and how would you envision your role in reforming criminal justice policy and policing?
Sure. At the federal level, it is true that there are only, a couple of points of entry. One is to recognize that it is a federal court interpretation that we have what all local police lean on, which is qualified immunity. And the reason that it's important, and by the way, this can be trumped by federal legislation. You're the attorney, but I suspect that state legislation could reverse the effects of it in individual states as well until there's a challenge, and then we'll see how that goes. But that might be a little bit into the weeds. The reason it's so important is not because qualified immunity affects so many cases. The truth of the matter is it affects a very, very, very small number of cases. But police officers believe that it affects a large number of cases. And for this reason, it has an effect on police culture and on police behavior that is not necessarily in community's interests, right? Qualified immunity basically says that police officers, as long as they're acting in good faith, they're going to be protected in some sense from court decisions when they make a mistake and violate someone's rights and this sort of thing. The truth of the matter is that police officers are typically protected by their employers anyway. And I'm not suggesting that that is completely inappropriate. Nobody would take almost any type of job if you made an honest mistake at work one day and, on some random Tuesday, you lost your house. That's not what we're talking about, the direction in which we want to go. But it is typically the case that it's the employers that are, in my view, all too protected by the courts. And it's not just qualified immunity, but the attitude of qualified immunity. I think that there's too much deference to law enforcement officers and agencies in most courts. And it makes it difficult for Americans to seek redress in court when they feel like they have been wronged. And what my own personal belief is that the idea of being able to seek redress is as American as apple pie. That you may have a case, you may have a crappy case, right? Maybe your case sucks. Maybe you think you were wronged and you weren't. You're just a very grumpy person. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have your ability to file and air your grievance and have it adjudicated. And I believe that if our system were more welcoming of that, you would find more cases that aren't just people being grumpy and have crappy cases, that you would find a number of people do have legitimate grievances, and that by airing these and holding agencies accountable, you would be able to make a contribution toward moving police culture in a way that I think makes sense. The object of the game is to move police culture in a way that requires officers to be more adherent to the set of values that better reflects their underlying communities. And there are police agencies that do a better job of this than others. There are agencies that do a horrible job of this, and there are police agencies that I have observed that I actually believe that aren't perfect, but make an effort and do, not a bad job of this at all. So my fundamental idea first, my number one idea, is to find a way to sunset the federal doctrine of qualified immunity, and at the same time require police officers to carry their own liability insurance, to be in one way or another bonded by a third party, by a private sector outside of the system, private sector party, that would provide liability insurance, but at the same time, because they would be outside of the system, because they would be operating in the private sector, I'm thinking here of an insurance company, right? They would be quite demanding of a plethora of information about not only the agency, but about the individual officer. I'm thinking of a model that is more akin than anything else to medical malpractice, right? Where, we don't say in malpractice courts, well, the doctor didn't mean to cut off the wrong foot, so, suck it up, buttercup. That's not how this works, right? Doctors are held accountable. There is liability insurance in between. A doctor is not going to lose a house over making an honest mistake. And by the way, none of this has anything to do with criminal court, right? You and I haven't even begun to talk about that.
Right.
Absolutely. If a cop breaks the law, personally, I believe that the punishment needs to be greater, not lesser, than if someone else broke the law. But we'll get into that in a moment. We're just talking about honest mistakes made by, a cop doing something dumb, right? And sometimes that takes the form of just honestly did something dumb because you had a bad day. But sometimes it takes the form of a cop having a bad attitude, not having gone through the proper training. Maybe not being the type of individual who should be in this line of business in the first place. These are not criminal things. They're just bad things that we need to fix and root out. And the same holds for, doctors. If you find someone that you're insuring is making the same types of mistakes, right? I mean, some of them are bad. I mean, you cut off the wrong foot. That might be someone that you want to drop as an insurance customer right away. But you can imagine other mistakes that aren't quite that egregious that, we're going to hike the premiums, right? And then at some point you price them out of the market. That's what we want to have happen with police officers and other folks in high liability businesses. We want the business of policing to look more like other industries, right? What we're talking about is finding ways to hold police officers accountable through a market system. You want police officers that are really good at this to be paid more, officers that are not good at this to be paid less, and the really crappy ones to get either completely priced out of the market or fired. So you want it to be more like other businesses. Does that make sense, first of all?
I think it does. You're introducing more market principles to the policing profession. And just like you mentioned medical malpractice, I have to have, as an attorney, legal malpractice insurance. And that helps moderate the level of risk I'm willing to take as an attorney. So that changes the culture. It changes the way I practice. It changes the profession. And so if officers knew that they might have to pay higher premiums if they act unreasonably, then of course that's going to moderate their behavior and limit the sorts of things that we see in the news, right, where police have acted out of hand in egregious ways.
That is the idea, to have some outside check on the system. And the other thing that I like about it is not merely that market mechanism of rising premium rates, as important as that is. The other thing that I like about it, possibly more, that's more important, is the idea of piercing this veil of secrecy and this lack of transparency that the police unions put up, right? Police agencies do a good job of stonewalling if you wanted information about almost anything. And, there are big debates about this. I don't mean to make it sound like this is a one-sided issue. Police officers are owed a little bit of privacy as well. They are human beings after all. But as public sector employees, as officers of the court and their agencies representing their communities, they need to be held to a higher standard. And we want a lot of that information to be more public than it is. We want these communities to be more involved, not less involved, in hiring, training, right? Screening, testing, discipline, raises. All of these things are completely opaque to communities, and in a surprising proportion of cases, in my own limited observation, quite opaque to the people who are in leadership positions. Try quizzing your mayor one day, mayor of your town, the head of your county. Tell me everything you know about how police officers in your town are trained. Have you ever been to the academy? Have you ever sat in on the classes? How are they chosen? How are they screened? Have you ever sat in on? My observation is that elected officials are horrible at this for a variety of reasons. It's opaque to them. They don't understand it. There's a certain level of incompetence. There's political capture. Nobody wants to look like they're anti-cop in a community where people are pro-cop. And by the way, that cuts both ways, right? Plenty of politicians are afraid to be pro-reform because they're afraid that'll sound pro-cop in a community that's very angry with their police department as well. It does cut both ways. And in this sense, when I see politicians say, either on the one hand, defund the police, or on the other hand, back the blue in every case, right? Even that latter, I never say anything that dumb when I was a cop, right? You knew damned well that, your buddies were making mistakes once. My goodness, it's just, is this a human business or is it not a human business? And I think that that type of sloganeering positioning is completely unhelpful. Reform is hard, it's tedious, it's complex, and it's okay not to understand all the parts. I don't think it's okay to say, well, it's hard and I'm just going to, sort of abdicate and go with the mob and say on either side, back the blue or, defund the police. I just don't find those helpful.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. And one thing I'd like you to talk about here momentarily is, we started out this conversation talking about leading with principle. And there are some in the libertarian movement who would say, why are we even talking about public sector employees and reforming the police? There should be no government employed police. It should all be a privatized security, that people should be responsible for their own security and businesses should be responsible for their own security. How do you address that concern?
There are two important things to be said that are offsetting and both nonetheless completely true. Policing is inherently a geographic function. It is not true that you can assign policing responsibility house by house or business by business. It's just, this is not me saying it because I wish it were true or wish it were not true. That's just the reality of the situation. There's no economically efficient way to say, these houses are going to be employing one agency and these houses over here are going to be employing another. The minimum efficient size of a police agency, I would say, is no smaller than a couple dozen officers. A couple dozen officers can handle a fairly large community. And anything smaller than that is just not going to make economic sense. Yeah, if you're a very wealthy family, you can afford your own security. That's fine, right? That's not what we're talking about, though. We're talking about, what do you do when a group of families, a group of people in a community, smaller than a couple thousand people? There's just no good way, economically efficient way, to break off and hire your own agency that small. Now, on the other hand, what we do want is for communities that are large enough to hire their own agency. I worked for a relatively modest sized town, 30, 40,000 people, 100 officers. Okay. You could get smaller than that. And there are a lot of agencies that are smaller than that, but you get the idea. 100 officers. That town did not have a lot of choices in terms of who it hired at the agency level. You could stick with our police department, or you could fire everybody and hire the sheriff's office. Those were basically the only two choices you had. And the town was lucky it had two choices. Most communities don't have any choice. For most communities, it's the sheriff's office, love it or shove it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And what we want is for there to be more choices. What we want is for communities to have the choice. You can hire your own employees, start your own police department. It is literally a department of the local governance structure. Or you could hire the sheriff's office, or in some places you can hire the state police. That happens. It depends on, states and state law and certain regs. But we want state law to change to be more encouraging, tolerant of the idea that you could hire a private sector organization if they were qualified, right? If it were qualified in the sense of clearing all the hurdles that your community set up, right? Your mayor and your commissioners should be able to say, this is what we want. These are the characteristics we're looking for. This is the training that we're looking for, the sort of processes, the principles, the protocols for hiring, firing, discipline. And we want to be involved in all of that going forward. You should be able to go out and hire an organization in the private sector to do, just like, a lot of communities allow themselves to hire a private sector organization to pick up the garbage, right? Why would you hamstring yourself? As far as I know, every state makes it extremely difficult, and in most places impossible for a public sector community, for a town or a county to go out and hire somebody else. It's just insurmountable, legally speaking, today, and we want that to change. And in that sense, Alex, this is an argument, this is a policy area that should sound very familiar to folks who want school choice, right? Not only do we want things to change at the teacher level, the police officer level, but we also want more flexibility at the school level, the agency level. We want the business of policing and the business of teaching to both look like more like other industries, right? Not only do you want differentiated pay for your officers, differentiated pay for your teachers, the good ones to get paid more and the crappy ones to get paid less and the really bad to get fired. That's what we want. But we also want everyone to be able to hire their own school. If you want your kid to go to a different school, you want to be able to hire a different school. You want competition at the agency level, at the organizational level. And we want that for police as well. So that's how I see bringing the private sector in to create more competition. Not at the house-by-house level. Yes, at the house-by-house level, that's where people are going to have their conversations, right? And this would foster conversations. You'd be talking to your neighbor, hey, agency XYZ is bidding for the contract. And, I'm going to go tell the mayor and the commissioners, I like that agency because I hear they've done a good job for, the town next door. That's the kind of conversation we hope to foster.
Right. And that's sort of in some ways, a continuation of these introducing market principles to policing, like we were talking about earlier with malpractice insurance, that by giving the communities choice to hire private sector, to provide for their own security, you're creating competition. And that not only changes the culture of policing, like we were talking about earlier with the elimination of qualified immunity, but it also changes the relationship between the police and the community, right? They're not there to see the community as subjects. They're there and they see them as, their employer, the people they are there to serve, right? And
that's exactly right. And I suspect, we don't have a lot of data on this, but both logic and theory and the little bit of data that we do have suggests that police agencies, just like any other organization, is going to be more responsive when they feel the heat of competition, right? Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily mean, by the way, that does not necessarily mean an automatically lighter touch. Less enforcement of the criminal code that you want to have enforced. It doesn't mean that at all. It might mean quite the opposite. We spend a lot of time talking about, well, an agency is too heavy-handed. They're not responsive to the community. They don't reflect the community's underlying values. They hired a bunch of guys that are assholes, and we need to change that culture. That's a conversation we have a lot, and that needs to change, right? And this competition I'm suggesting would make a contribution toward that. But it also needs to be said that you might have some of the complete opposite, which is, we hired a bunch of officers, and because of the politics at the commissioner level, the mayor level, whoever's running this county, whoever's running this city, they have imposed on that police agency this political feeling that they should be standing down, right? And the community's unhappy because, no, you don't want police officers doing stupid things, but most communities want their police officers to do what it is they want them to do, to enforce the criminal code in a way that's responsible and that preserves people's lives and property and respects their rights to safety. You want some of that. And it may be that the only way to correct course in certain situations is to replace the agency's lock, stock, and barrel. And for that reason, you also want competition among agencies, because it might mean you need to bring in a different group in order to actually enforce the criminal code in a way that people want it to be enforced.
Yeah. So we've moved on a little bit from qualified immunity, but I want to go back to that for just a moment, because you mentioned sort of a legislative solution to it, sunsetting qualified immunity. What's interesting to me about qualified immunity is that this is a doctrine, a court-created doctrine. It wasn't something that was ever created by the legislature. So that puts the legislature in a bit of a weird position. How does it eliminate something it never created? This is something that was made up. But I think this is an issue that's incredibly important, which is why I want to touch back on it. And this is one of the things that's never made any sense to me about why there's not enough political will or political capital to do something about qualified immunity. Because I think a lot of the general public doesn't understand how it works. And so I just briefly want to point out, and I don't have the case at my fingertips, but there was a case where an officer used an unreasonable degree of force against a suspected criminal who was on the ground, and they were protected by qualified immunity. So despite having unused reasonable force, they were protected because there wasn't a previous case notifying the officer that this was something that was unreasonable. So there's sort of this circular argument, like, how is there ever going to be a case that's factually a factual twin to what's happening currently so that the officer would have been on notice, right?
Right.
But the problem, as I see it, is that, and you alluded to this earlier, that the people who are tasked with enforcing the law get a pass when they break the law, when they use an unreasonable degree of force or violate the law in some way. But as citizens, there is no excuse for not knowing the law. So we are held as citizens to a higher standard than law enforcement. Is that a fair assessment of the situation?
I think in many times it is a very fair assessment. The other side, the counter argument is that in criminal cases, there's absolutely no pass, right? If an officer does something intentionally that violates law, there's no pass. Now, we can all argue that courts have been too deferential to police officers in that context as well, but that's not a qualified immunity argument. That's just, juries and judges and prosecutors are oftentimes too deferential. And you can argue that round or square. I personally feel like the system is too deferential to police officers in the context of criminal code. That's my personal take on it. But I am not completely insensitive to communities wanting to be somewhat deferential, because I think people recognize they're asking police officers to do certain things that put themselves in awkward situations, where I don't want to use the phrase carried away, but you make split-second decisions that are hard for most people to sort of relate to. Mistakes get made that look awfully intentional in the light of the next day, but at the moment, it was an honest mistake, even if you knew the law and you're familiar with the law and you were well trained. people still screw up. So I get why there is some deference from the system. I get that. I do believe that the system is way too differential to police officers in the criminal context.
Yeah.
In the qualified immunity context, you're exactly right, which is why I say qualified immunity doesn't apply to that many cases directly, because in the vast majority of cases, that finding of the twin does make it, that is when it pinches, right? That is when you can finally say, well, you should have known. But the number of cases is large where it has been well adjudicated, right? There are any number of things that a police officer cannot say, well, I didn't know. The vast majority, if you think about the hundreds of little tiny things you do during the day, the vast majority of them have been well adjudicated. It's only once in a while that we get into these weird cases where people are arguing about, well, is there a case that should have alerted the officer to know? And it really sounds weird and horrible. Thankfully, it's not that often. But I agree with you. It sucks when it does. It sucks when you're making the case that an officer did not have a responsibility to be aware just because there wasn't a case exactly the same. I find that to be bullshit, unadulterated. But that is how it works, and I think that's one of the reasons why we got to get rid of it. I mean, as to go back to our surgeon cutting off the wrong foot, you don't get to say, well, this foot wasn't exactly the same as every other foot that's been cut off, and so it's natural that I would have gotten confused and cut off the wrong one. That doesn't fly.
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't fly. And so for that reason, I think that these things are better adjudicated privately. I trust the judgment of an insurance company asking for all of the information. And however the court may adjudicate that particular case in terms of payment, the insurance company is going to know darn well whether or not that officer is a good risk going forward. Yep. And I want that opinion involved in determining whether the officer ought to remain on the job.
Yeah, there's the insurance component, but then also if there's private security that a community has hired, there may be some arbitration provision, so you can resolve disputes through some arbitration mechanism, which is far more efficient and fair typically than going through the court process.
Far more, spoken like an experienced attorney. And it also needs to be said that many times these problems are not at the officer level, but they're at the training level, they're at the agency level. Maybe it's not the case that you see one officer make a mistake and then that same officer makes the same mistake. Okay, he or she is a bad risk. But maybe it's this officer made a bad mistake and then another officer made the same damn mistake in the same agency a week later. That's the red flag that we're looking for that might say we need to replace the agency because they just don't get it. Either their values are wrong or the training is wrong. And under today's system, you would have to have an intervention from whom, right? The union is going to prevent anybody from coming in and reformulating training. You would have to have political leadership that is enormously strong, and we just don't typically have that. You would have to have political leadership come in and demand a change in training when the political leadership typically has no idea what the training is like. Yeah. This is one of the few benefits, maybe the only benefit of the FBI or state-level investigatory agencies that oversee local police departments when something goes wrong, right? The FBI collects data across agencies, and once in a while, when something is really horrific, the FBI can come in, conduct an investigation. The Department of Justice can demand a consent decree or some sort of operational agreement, a memorandum of understanding. Things will be different going forward, a lot of which doesn't get backed up by a court very efficiently. But at the state level, I personally think it works better, where if an agency screws up once, screws up twice, a good state agency is going to come in and say, what the hell is going on there? And that's of some value. I'm not a fan of criminal codes being enforced by agencies that are not close to the community. I'm not a big fan of state agencies taking up the big cases and the FBI taking up the really big cases. Just because a case is big, that does not, to me, it does not imply anything will be better if the FBI takes it over. There's a matter of resources, but that can be handled by state agencies helping out. It doesn't mean the FBI needs to take it over.
Some people might say, Mike, that sounds crazy. Your example about the foot and the doctor, just because the second foot wasn't identical to the first one, that's not a good excuse. Well, in practice, that's how qualified immunity works. And that I didn't flesh this out, but that was the case I was referring to earlier, where the suspect was laying down, an officer acted or used unreasonable degree of force. In a subsequent case with a different officer, the facts were almost identical, except that the suspect was kneeling rather than laying down. And because the cases weren't identical, because the person was kneeling rather than laying down, even though it was almost exactly the same otherwise, the officer in the second case was given the protection of qualified immunity. So that's
Right.
almost the same as your foot example.
It's exactly. It is almost the same, and that's why I brought it up. I think you're exactly right. And what we want is for an insurance company to say, look, that's a lot of BS. This guy is not a good risk for us.
Yeah. All right, Mike. Well,
and we want it adjudicated by a jury, right?
Yeah.
Let the jury decide. Or if you waive your right to a jury, have a judge to decide or a panel. But you want courts to adjudicate this. You want Americans to have their redress in court. And maybe the case isn't that good, but you don't want some federal doctrine coming in and saying, automatically you're not going to get your day in court. This is not going to go to a trial because of some doctrine that says there was no case that should have alerted the officer that he was doing something wrong. That strikes me as something for the community to decide in a trial.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Mike, we could talk about qualified immunity. At least I could all day. There are all sorts of objections and, of course, counterpoints to the qualified immunity discussion. But there are many other topics, and I'd like to touch on a few others anyway. I know you mentioned the drug war. Of course, that's not the end all be all. That's not the source of all problems within policing, but I'd like to touch on that and sort of this notion of prohibition and what that does to the law. And but then also, one thing that's been in the news a lot in the last few years is this idea or concept of no-knock warrants. Would you mind to address those two issues, the drug war and then also no-knock warrants?
Yeah, I don't mind at all. No-knock warrants is a little bit less complicated, so let's start with that. And again, I'm not completely insensitive to the counter argument. I'm not trying to say anyone who ever believed in no-knock warrants is a complete idiot and hates his community and is not patriotic and we need to shoot that person. That's not what I'm trying to say. But on balance, through trial and error, we have learned over the years that these are dangerous and ineffective solutions compared to the other solutions that we have, right? It is rare that you have a situation where a violent felon is on the other side of the door and you have to get to them, because if you don't, something really horrible is going to happen, right? If that's the case, we're having a conversation. I don't mind there being an exception to what you and I are about to discuss, which is getting rid of no-knock warrants. I don't mind there being an exception. If there is, if there are truly emergent circumstances, if it is truly the case that if you don't get that guy out of there, he's going to shoot somebody, right? Active shooter cases, obviously, and you and I can talk about Uvalde and other cases that have disappointed us as well. There are plenty of exceptions where we absolutely want officers to take care of business now, right? I get that. But in the vast majority, in 99% of the time, when a police agency knows that there is someone on the other side of that door for whom we have an arrest warrant, right? We know that we have the authority and the obligation to the community to arrest that person. The community wants that person arrested. There's a violent crime that person has committed. We've got probable cause, and a court has signed off on this. It is typically not the case that is a good idea to kick in the door, scare the living hell out of anyone on the other side of it, hope that they do not take matters into their own hands with a weapon themselves, right? And that you're going to find the right person at the right time. No one else is going to be involved. No one else is going to be hurt. And that's going to be resolved peacefully in a way that neither an officer nor the subject or nor any bystander is going to get hurt. That's a heavy ask compared to, let's wait until they come out. Now, depending on the level of importance, maybe you assign someone to hang outside their house and wait. But, the vast majority of people that you want to arrest, you can bump into them at the grocery store or some other place. It is just exceedingly rare that there is some emergency tied to bringing this person to justice. And we have seen kicking in a door, right? And going after someone horrifically dangerous. Things went wrong in the agency that I worked for while I was working for them. Thankfully, I was never, involved. I have never served a no-knock warrant myself. Is typically a specially trained group that executes no-knock warrants. I have kicked in doors, that is true. But it's because I had very, very specific information that something was going to go wrong if that door didn't open now, right? The vast majority of those circumstances are threatened suicides. And in only a couple of cases, it was because you heard something violent happening and you don't know exactly what's going on, but you have every reason to believe that that's something that has to stop, that someone is having their rights violated and it's not by the police department. So these are behaviors that communities either want or don't want. And I think that communities need to take the bull by the horns and flesh these out. For my money, if, in my community, I would not want no-knock warrants being signed, being enforced.
One of the reasons that I brought up no-knock warrants at the same time is the drug war is that it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong or if you have a different perspective of the history here, but that no-knock warrants largely came about as a result of the drug war. That the fear was that if officers followed the common law doctrine, of knocking and announcing their presence, that the evidence would be lost. And
right.
So while you're right, there may be these rare circumstances where a no-knock warrant might be practical for a violent felon. In most instances, these are executed in an effort to find evidence of drugs.
Right. All too often.
Yeah.
And it's that example, which is, by the way, I agree with you. It's my perception. It's actually the majority, and in many communities, the vast majority of no-knock warrants being served are for this reason. I think that it illustrates just how dopey the concept is. You're willing to risk the lives of everyone inside that home or business. Risk the lives of your officers, right? And not just lives. I mean, people get hurt without being killed, and you don't hear about it as often. You're willing to risk all of that safety in order for what? So that you can better conduct your prosecution. Wow, that is not setting the bar too high. You know what I mean? For me to endanger people's safety, it's going to have to be for something more important than the collection of evidence. That's my own view. And the reason I say, well, that's my own view, is because I do think that communities have a right to decide how they want their criminal code to be enforced. But I think that the vast majority of communities would agree that that's a bad idea. And I think it's up to officers to participate in that conversation and to let people know how dangerous these situations are. As a matter of principle, I think that no-knock warrants ought to be viewed as a violation of the Constitution. Indeed, knock warrants ought to be a violation of the Constitution. It is not just the absence of notification, but I think that it's a violation of the Castle Doctrine generally. To me, the fact that you're knocking on the door doesn't make everything that comes after that okay. You know, knock, knock. I'm about to violate your rights. I'm about to violate the spirit of the Constitution, but at least I've told you. You know, that doesn't make it. That doesn't make it okay, and it doesn't make it much less dangerous. There are those who might argue it makes it more dangerous. You know, knock, knock. You might want to go get a gun because I'm going to kick this door in. And if you miss the word police in this conversation, you're definitely going to want to get a gun and be ready for what happens when I kick the door in.
Yeah.
So to your point, there are other reasons for ending the war on drugs. And I think that those fall into two broad categories. And depending on which American to whom you're speaking, they might be more sensitive to one argument or the other. And I see these as two very different ways to approach the issue. One is the government just doesn't have the moral authority, the ethical legs to stand on to make decisions for you about what you're going to do with your body. Full stop. Full stop. And that's a concept that we don't talk about enough in the United States. We talked about it a little bit in the context of seat belts and helmets, and then it came up again with, vaccines. But I would offer to your audience, Alex, the following example. See if you like it. If you like it, it's yours. Imagine, as a thought experiment, the perfect vaccine. Imagine there was such a thing as a vaccine that would 100% guaranteed save your life if you took it. 100% guaranteed you're going to die if you don't take it. You're going to die a miserable death soon. It shuts down transmissibility 100%. It's got absolutely no side effects. It's been tested in the short run. It's been tested in the long run. It's completely free. This is a thought experiment. Work with me. Would the government have the right to coerce you to take it? Would the government have the right to penalize you even $1 or to pay you even $1 to take the vaccine?
The answer is no from my perspective.
The answer has got to be no. That's exactly right. Let me offer another thought experiment. Imagine that the history of economic thought was all bullshit. That what we have learned over the past century is all wrong. That people don't make better decisions for themselves. That the government actually could make better decisions for you. That Hayek and von Mises, they were all wrong. The government actually can process information better than individuals can, even at the macroeconomic level, and your life would be better. Your food would be better, it'd be cheaper, your clothes would be better, your relationships would be better, smells would be sweeter, and colors would be brighter, and the whole world would get along better if we would just let the government make all the decisions for us. It's a weird thing for a libertarian to say, but work with me, right?
Yep.
If socialism worked, if capitalism and freedom and liberty were all wrong, would the government have the moral authority, the ethical right to make decisions for you, knowing that the government is going to make better decisions for you than you would yourself? Again, the answer has to be no. It is your right to make bad decisions. It is your right to make decisions for yourself. And I also believe that in some sense, it is your obligation to make decisions for yourself. This is your obligation as a human being, that it is for you to find your path, as Christians say. It is for you to live your life by your own standards. It is up to you to determine those standards and then to adhere to them as closely as possible, whatever those standards look like. It's not merely an opportunity, it is an obligation. It is something up to which you are called to live. And I think that that is an important backdrop against which we need to evaluate the war on drugs. That the government should not be telling you how to live, even if you're wrong in some objective sense, which is hard to imagine, and even if the government were right. And then the other argument is the war on drugs just doesn't work.
Yeah, which you hear a lot of talk about that. In fact, I had a discussion recently. I'm more compelled by the first argument, that it's immoral to force people to live a certain way, as long as it's not harming other people. But also, I think the more and more, I think it's compelling that the war on drugs doesn't work. It's been going on for decades. I often point to alcohol prohibition and sort of the effects of that. We don't see Al Capone and Bugs Moran and those folks. They went out of business as soon as prohibition of alcohol ended, in all the violence surrounding the alcohol trade. And I think the same sort of thing would happen, right, with drugs today. But I was having a discussion recently with a judge who is in favor of the war on drugs, as are most judges, especially ones who are former prosecutors. But the point that he was making is that, yes, the drug only directly harms the person who consumes it, but the secondary effect of that is so great. It's greater than it is for somebody who consumes cheeseburgers and gets fat. It's so great that society has to do something about it. Of course, that never escapes the point that you're making, that it's still that person's body, but that by consuming this drug that is so harmful that they consume welfare, or they die and they need emergency medical services, or they create some huge burden on society, and that harm is so great.
Well,
that,
and it
that we have
increases
to
the
outlaw.
likelihood that you will become criminal.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So what do you say? What do you say to that argument?
I absolutely agree. It does suck when people do bad things, and when they do things that increase the propensity of them doing other bad things to people. He's right. That's a bad thing. I also think he's probably right that society should do something about that. But there's a difference between the society should do something about that and the government, the appointed, anointed monopolist when it comes to force and power and violence, is the vehicle through which society decides to do something about that. Those are two different things. And I get, if I grew up as a prosecutor, maybe you were a cop and then you were a prosecutor and then you were a judge, and that's a system in which you grew up. As we used to say in Washington, where you stand is where you sit. I get that. That you necessarily almost have to advocate for the system if you're a creature of it. I get that. I'm not angry at the judge himself. and maybe someone does need to advocate. If you believe in a system of advocacy, maybe we want the judge to at least put up an argument for the system that he has helped develop and for which he works so earnestly. I mean, if he doesn't stand up for it, nobody else will. But I don't think it stands up in the light of day. I don't think it's very easy to argue. I would hate to be in his shoes and make the argument on empirical grounds that the war on drugs has gone well, that it has diminished the rate at which people die from overdoses, that it has reduced the rate at which attendant crime has taken place, crime meant to support addictions or crime committed by people who are of compromised cognizance because of drugs. I don't think that, and I appreciate the fact that it's impossible to design a study to tease this out. I do. I get that. I spent enough years in social sciences to understand that you can't prove everything on empirical grounds. But if you can't, doesn't the deference have to be on the side of liberty? But having said that, I think it's very difficult to support his case through data. The truth of the matter is that we know that the number of deaths has continued to go up, not down. That is an argument that says the system is not working. It's not an argument that says the system is working. We also know that fentanyl, for example, is responsible. I hate to say this, an inanimate object has some responsibility. Fentanyl is involved in an increasing number, a disproportionate number, a dramatic number in recent years of deaths. And yet, fentanyl is a substance. It is not inherently more criminal than anything else, but it is more deadly. Why is that? Why is that? Because it is so powerful that it becomes a cheap substitute for other drugs. Are these people killing themselves on purpose? No. These are mistakes. These are accidents. It's not a mistake. It's not an accident that they use a drug. It may not even be, in many cases, a mistake that they use fentanyl. But it is a mistake that they accidentally use too much. And this is because this is not let me use the word regulated. This is not a regulated industry. Not only is it not regulated by the government, it is not regulated by any sense of market forces. Remember that the vast majority of regulation of markets in the United States is done by market participants. Market participants demanding to know something about the product. People providing a product, recognizing that if I don't tell you about the damn car, you're not going to buy it, right? If I don't tell you what the sweater is made out of, you're not going to buy it. If I don't have a brand with some historical value attached to the product, you're not going to spend as much money for it. These are all things that are absent from businesses, gangs, the businesses that are engaged in the drug industry. The drug industry is completely counterproductive because the war on drugs drives out anyone worth a damn who would otherwise be participating in this market.
Yeah, and I appreciate your response. And one of the reasons that I asked you to do this podcast is you have experience as a police officer, but you're also an economist, which I think is often missing from this discussion about the war on drugs, and often missing from the conversation, especially among judges and prosecutors, is any idea of what economic powers or forces are at play with respect to the war on drugs. As you say, I think the judge here is overlooking the enormous cost associated with outlawing the drug. There's the police state that's built up around it. And of course, the idea is that the reason the war on drugs hasn't worked over the last 50 years is because we haven't done it hard enough. We've been soft on crime for too long, and we just need to do it more. Okay, which has eroded our privacy, has eroded our liberty in just unimaginable ways.
Look at the
And
incarceration rates. You can't look at the incarceration rates and at the same time argue that we have been soft on the war on drugs.
right,
Truly, Alex, we live under the world's most oppressive criminal justice system. The
yeah,
most oppressive criminal justice system. We don't poison people and send them to Siberia for arguing with Joe Biden or Donald Trump. I'll give you that. Although I won't give you that the CIA hasn't done that. But, I get there are certain cases that make other governments around the world look even stupider than ours. I'm not trying to argue that everything that our government does is, dumber than what everything every other government does. But we have the world's most oppressive, broadly speaking, the world's most oppressive criminal justice system. The costs are enormous. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that the reason we have disproportionate, persistent intergenerational poverty in the United States is because of the combination of the war on drugs, the oppressiveness of the criminal justice system that is attendant to that, but also the other package of bad local public policy, bad schools because of the monopoly that we grant to local public schools, bad housing policy, bad zoning policy, bad welfare policy. When you add all of this together, it's very corrosive to the American family. It destroys individual lives, and it makes it very difficult for many communities at the community level. It makes it very difficult for communities to make a go of it. I lay this all at the feet of bad public policy.
I think bad public policy, I agree with you entirely. But also, I think you mentioned earlier, and I just wanted to flesh this out a little bit, that people that use illegal drugs aren't trying to kill themselves. And that's why oftentimes they overdose in public, so that if they do take an amount that's too much, that somebody might find them so that they don't die, right? So this is an unintended consequence of the war on drugs, right? Because as you mentioned, we get these products that are more potent for a lower price because they've been forced into the black market, right? So that's why we have things like fentanyl starting to show up so frequently in these overdoses.
Black markets kill.
Yeah. So not only does the war on drugs fail the moral test, as you laid out, it also fails the empirical evidence test that you've laid out as well. So I think it's been a complete and utter failure from both perspectives.
I agree. There's not even a healthy debate to be had anymore, in my view. At least if the war on drugs were working, right? If we had some experience in the past where a lot of people were dying and then we made it illegal and all of a sudden the death rate went down and life was better, at least we're having an argument, right? At least we're having a debate. I just don't see the debate as being very robust at this point, and so I'll give the 60s and the 70s a pass, right? I'll give my folks' generation a pass. We didn't know better. I think everyone was hopeful that a heavy-handed government could help people's lives. It just turned out not to be the case, and that failure has undermined on a cultural level, not just a community level, but has undermined the United States, has undermined the American citizenry at a cultural level, and that's a big deal. And so in that sense, I don't mean to suggest that particular individuals are evil, but allowing a system to remain in place that is not working, that is undermining both our economy and our culture, allowing that to continue, that's evil.
Yeah. Well, Mike, we've been going for a little over an hour now. I don't want to. I told you we'd cut it cut it to an end or close to an hour, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you're a busy man, but I do want to give you an opportunity here in closing to plug your campaign, to plug your website and any other resources that you'd like to point our listeners to. I know I've got some links here that I'll share in the show notes, of course, including your campaign website, which is MikeTermaat.com. That's MikeTermaat.com. So, Mike, thanks again for joining the show. And please let our listeners know where they can find out more about you and anything else you'd like to plug before we close up.
I appreciate that, Alex. Thanks for our time together. You mentioned being an economist. It's funny, as I often told my trainees when I was with the police department, if you hadn't been a professional economist before becoming a cop will turn you into an economist, because you see the effects of bad public policy at the local level up close and personal. You see it affect people that you grow to care about, right? One of the things that, this is not something you asked about, but I'll mention it anyway. One of the things that you find as a police officer that I did not anticipate, much of what I learned as a police officer, I did not anticipate. But one of the things was, it is true that you fall in love with your community. I'm not even suggesting that's necessarily a good thing, but you do. You tend to, if you're the kind of person who cares at all, and I would argue that the vast majority of people who become police officers give a shit. They do. Nobody goes into the business because they don't care. It doesn't pay that much, right? Maybe you shouldn't be in the business for other reasons, but people care, and you fall in love with your community. You start to take it personally. You take it personally when there's a crime committed. You take it personally when a family that you know is affected, when something bad happens in your zone on a block for which you feel some responsibility. And the war on drugs is something that I think a lot of police officers resent. I was lucky. I was able to find a police agency that had a separate vice unit. I didn't have to be involved with the war on drugs except for doing CPR on people. I didn't have to be involved with, for example, the traffic very much either. We had a separate traffic unit. I didn't have to be involved in hitting quotas so that the city could make its revenue targets or something silly like that. I had a good experience. But it does mean that you have to take very seriously the idea that you're the last, sometimes the first and the last refuge, the last protection of the Constitution. That you have a lot of latitude out there depending on your attitude about how things are going to go. And if you don't stand up for the Bill of Rights, sometimes, there's no one else who's going to do it. You have to take that very seriously. I appreciate you taking the time to chat about it. The one thing that I would plug is something I think is sort of fun that some of your viewers might want to check out. We have an AI bot under development, an artificial intelligence site. We call it LISA, the Libertarian Intelligence System Application. It's at libertarianintelligence.org. You can go to MikeTermaat.com and link from there, which might be easier. And it also might be easier to link from our platform, which is goldnewdeal.org. Goldnewdeal.org is easier to spell than MikeTermaat.com because there's two A's in Termaat. And you can link there, check out the AI bot. This is a bot designed to answer questions the way a libertarian would. So I ask it a public policy question. The whole point is to help spread the idea of libertarian thoughts and solutions beyond the Libertarian Party. So it's kind of fun. Like all AI bots, you can get it to say something dumb once in a while. But when you do, let me know, right? Email me, text me, call me, reach out through social media. All my contact information is on these websites. Email Lisa at MikeTermaat.com and let us know what you think of it, good or bad. We are in the business of training it every week. It gets better every week and every month. And by the time the nomination comes and we enter the general election in May, we want it to be really good. So I'm asking your audience to help us join in the effort to perfect the AI bot.
To train Lisa. Very, very cool. Well, Mike, thanks so much for joining the show. I really enjoyed our conversation. There's so much more we could talk about.
And we will someday in the future.
Yeah, that sounds great. And of course, I'd encourage our listeners to check out your website. I think you've got a lot of great content there. You've linked to a lot of other conversations you've had with other folks, and definitely encourage them to go listen to those as well. Of course, you mentioned the Gold New Deal. I particularly encourage our listeners to go check out your perspectives on sort of money and banking issues. I think that you set yourself apart in that way. So definitely encourage our listeners to go check that out. So Mike, thanks again.
Thank you, Alex. Good to be with you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. Definitely go check out ter.maat.com. I'll link to it, of course, in the show notes, along with the other links that we've mentioned here in the show. Please always, as always, like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. Of course, you can find our content on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, X, and on our website at forgeoffreedom.com. Thanks, everybody, and until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.